At the Grand Galactic Ball, held in the magnificent palace of the Talhorian Empire, the air was thick with excitement. It was the event of the century, a gathering of the most powerful and influential beings in the galaxy. Members of royal families from distant planets, military commanders, and influential political figures mingled under the soft glow of shimmering chandeliers. The music was elegant, the food was abundant, and the atmosphere was intoxicating. However, despite the grandeur of the evening, all eyes were on one person, Princess Aurelia, the enigmatic and stunning heir to the Talhorian throne. Her beauty was legendary, with silken, silver hair cascading like a waterfall down her back, her violet eyes gleaming with intelligence and a sense of mystery. She wore a flowing gown of dark obsidian that shimmered with stars, a perfect reflection of the universe's vastness, much like her royal status. Yet, despite her appearance, her demeanor was anything but inviting. Time and again, the galaxy's most distinguished suitors approached her, offering flattery and extravagant gifts, but Aurelia rejected them all, her icy gaze cutting through their words like a blade. There was no hint of warmth in her eyes, only coldness, a sharp indifference that left even the most powerful men in the room feeling small. Aurelia was not impressed by wealth, nor by status. Her rejection was not out of malice, but a deep-seated belief that no one could truly understand her. They saw her as a prize to be won, a beautiful object to add to their collection. They didn't see her as a person with her own desires, dreams, and fears. It was in this cold isolation that Jake Callahan, a human diplomat from Earth, found himself observing the princess. Unlike the others, Jake wasn't interested in flaunting his wealth or power. He wasn't here to impress. As a military strategist and a man with a strong sense of diplomacy, he had witnessed many galactic customs, but he had never seen a woman like Aurelia. Intrigued by her, Jake wondered what lay beneath the surface of her cold exterior. It was clear she wasn't like the others. Most would be intimidated, but Jake felt a strange sense of resolve. He had heard the rumors. Princess Aurelia had rejected every suitor that came her way, and the galaxy was beginning to wonder why. Was it pride, a desire for power, or perhaps something deeper? Regardless of the reason, Jake was determined to find out. As he stood in the corner of the room, watching her from afar, he didn't see a princess who needed to be saved or a woman to be won. He saw a person trapped behind walls of her own making, and something inside him stirred, an unexpected feeling that perhaps, just maybe, he could be the one to break those walls down. The evening continued, but Jake's focus remained fixed on Aurelia, wondering what kind of challenge it might be to win her heart, or if such a feat was even possible. Jake Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about Princess Aurelia. As the evening wore on, he continued to observe her from the edge of the ballroom, where he was quietly sipping a drink. She was surrounded by noble suitors, all eager to gain her favor, but every time one approached, her cold, uninterested demeanor swiftly turned them away. It was almost as if she enjoyed watching them squirm, but Jake saw beyond her icy exterior. There was a loneliness in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place but made her seem more vulnerable than untouchable. Most men would have been intimidated by her powerful presence, but not Jake. He had faced greater challenges in his life: wars, political battles, and dangerous enemies. But this was different. There was a strange feeling in his gut, an urge to speak to her, to understand why someone like her, so beautiful and regal, seemed so disconnected from the world around her. With a deep breath, Jake finally made his decision. He excused himself from the other diplomats and made his way toward the princess. As he approached, the air seemed to crackle with tension, and a hush fell over the people nearby. His sudden boldness didn't go unnoticed, but Jake wasn't here to play the games of the other suitors. He was here to get answers. Aurelia's eyes flicked toward him as he came closer, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile or greet him like she had with the others. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, her violet eyes scanning him with a piercing, almost challenging gaze. Jake met her stare confidently, not flinching under the weight of her attention. "Princess Aurelia," he said smoothly, offering a respectful bow. "I've seen how you've been turning suitors away all night, and I have to admit, I'm curious. Why is it that none of them are good enough for you?" His words, direct and unflinching, seemed to catch her off guard. She tilted her head, studying him for a moment before responding, her voice cold but with a trace of amusement. "You think you're different?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. Jake smiled slightly, not intimidated by her icy response. "I'm not here to flatter you or present you with grand gestures," he replied honestly. "I just want to know why." There was a long pause as Aurelia's expression remained unreadable. Jake could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, though the subtle recognition that he wasn't like the others who only saw her as a prize to be won. "I don't need anyone," she said, her voice softer now, but still firm. "Not to rule, not to prove anything. I've rejected them because they don't see me. They see a trophy." Jake stepped closer, his voice steady but sincere. "Then let me be the first to see you, not the princess, but the person beneath the title. No one else has asked you why, have they?" Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. "And why should you care?" she asked, clearly intrigued but still holding on to her pride. Jake smiled, his eyes sincere. "Maybe because I'm curious, and curiosity has gotten me into a lot of trouble in my life." The briefest of smiles played on her lips, though she quickly masked it again. "You are bold, human, but don't mistake this for an invitation." Yet, despite her words, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a crack in her icy exterior that Jake had already begun to chip away at. The game had only just begun. The next day, Jake Callahan found himself once again drawn to the palace, this time under different circumstances. After his conversation with Princess Aurelia the night before, a sense of curiosity lingered in the air between them, a tension that felt more like a challenge than a polite exchange. He hadn't expected her to change her behavior overnight, but something about her intrigued him even more now. He had broken through the surface, just a little, and he could feel her walls beginning to crack, albeit slowly. As he walked through the palace halls, he was surprised when he was summoned to a private room, a room he hadn't seen before. It was tucked away from the busy parts of the palace, an area filled with ancient relics and objects from Salhur's rich history. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Princess Aurelia, her back to him as she examined a complex puzzle on a pedestal. Without turning around, she spoke, her voice sharp but with an edge of something that seemed to mix curiosity with a hint of challenge. "You're early," she said, her eyes still fixed on the puzzle. Jake, unfazed, stepped forward. "I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be here at all, but I thought you might have something interesting in mind." Aurelia's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was almost imperceptible. "I have a challenge for you, human," she said, finally turning to face him. Her gaze was calculating, as if measuring every movement he made. "You say you want to know the real me. Well, you'll need to prove you're worthy of it. You've already shown me you can ask questions, but can you rise to meet the tests I set for you?" Jake's eyebrows lifted, intrigued but undeterred. "What kind of tests?" he asked, his voice steady. Aurelia's eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and something else, perhaps a challenge, perhaps even admiration. "A battle of wits," she said. "The smartest of the suitors have always failed, thinking they can win me over with simple gestures or empty words. You, however, seem different. So, let's see how much you can truly understand." She gestured toward the intricate puzzle before her, a complex arrangement of ancient symbols and mechanisms that seemed almost impossible to decipher. Jake studied it for a moment, his mind racing. He had faced challenges like this before, but this felt different. This wasn't about just winning her favor. It was about proving something deeper, something that mattered more than all the grand displays of wealth and power that had been offered to her. "All right," Jake said, his tone confident but focused. "Let's do this." Aurelia watched him closely as he moved toward the pedestal, the puzzle seeming more like a trap than a simple test. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft click of mechanisms as Jake turned the pieces, carefully considering his every move. Aurelia didn't say a word, but her gaze never left him. It was a silent challenge, a way for her to see if this human could truly understand her complexity, her struggles, and her mind. Jake didn't rush. He had learned that some battles weren't won with speed, but with patience. With each piece he moved, he felt closer to understanding the strange woman who had captivated his thoughts. And as he finally aligned the last piece of the puzzle, he looked up to find Aurelia's expression unreadable. She was silent for a moment, and Jake held his breath, wondering if he had failed, or worse, if he had somehow misinterpreted her challenge. But then, slowly, she spoke. "Impressive," she said, her voice carrying a hint of admiration. Jake allowed himself a small smile, but he knew the game was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Jake Callahan felt a surge of accomplishment as he solved the puzzle, but he quickly realized that Aurelia wasn't the type of person to be easily impressed. Her eyes remained steady, cool, and calculating as she acknowledged his success. "That was impressive," she said quietly, her voice betraying only a hint of respect, but not enough to let him think he had won anything. She stepped closer to the pedestal, running her fingers lightly over the intricate markings that Jake had just solved. "But solving a puzzle doesn't prove you understand anything about me," she continued, her gaze never leaving the now activated artifact. "It only proves you know how to follow a set of instructions." Jake didn't flinch. He had expected her response, expected her to challenge him further. He had to admit, he was starting to admire her, though he wasn't sure if she would ever truly allow him to see the person she kept hidden behind those walls of ice. "Then what does prove that?" he asked, his voice steady, not showing a hint of frustration. Aurelia turned toward him slowly, her violet eyes locking onto his. "There's more to me than intellect or strength. I need someone who sees beyond all of this. The crown, the title, the expectations. I need someone who understands the weight of the responsibilities I carry." She motioned to the artifacts in the room, the relics of ancient Talhorian kings and queens. "These are the real challenges of my life. I am not a game to be won or a puzzle to be solved. If you want to prove you truly understand me, you will need to face something far greater than any test of intellect or strength." Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration mixed with curiosity. This woman, this princess, had made him feel like he was playing a game without knowing the rules. He had thought that by solving the puzzle, he was making progress, but now it seemed like that was just the beginning. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice low but serious. Aurelia's lips curled slightly, as if she had been waiting for him to ask that very question. "I want you to follow me," she said, her tone soft but commanding. "There is a place beyond this palace, a place where only the strongest and most trusted can enter. If you are truly ready to understand me, to understand the burden of my position, you will need to pass through this test." Her words piqued Jake's curiosity, and though he had no idea what lay ahead, he was willing to follow her anywhere. "Lead the way," he said, his resolve unwavering. Aurelia gave him a sharp look, as if she were evaluating his sincerity. After a moment, she nodded, and with a flick of her wrist, a hidden door in the room slid open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. As they stepped into the shadows, Jake couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anticipation. This was no longer just a game or a challenge. It felt like the beginning of something far more significant. Something that would reveal not only Aurelia's true nature but perhaps his own. And as the door closed behind them, Jake knew that whatever awaited them in the darkness, he was ready. The passage Aurelia led Jake through was unlike anything he had seen before in the Grand Palace. It was dark, the only light coming from faintly glowing crystals embedded in the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced across the stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of old stone and forgotten history. As they walked in silence, Jake couldn't help but wonder what kind of test awaited him. It was clear now that Aurelia was not one to do anything lightly. Every move she made, every word she spoke, carried weight. The deeper they went into the corridor, the more Jake realized how much he was willing to prove himself to her, not just for her affection, but for a chance to truly understand her, to break through the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Finally, they reached a large, circular room at the end of the passage. In the center of the room stood a massive stone door, its surface covered in symbols and ancient markings that Jake couldn't decipher. The door seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly with an inner light, as if it had been waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. Aurelia stopped in front of the door and turned to Jake, her expression serious. "This is the heart of my kingdom," she said quietly. "Behind this door lies the truth of who I am, who I must be to my people. It's a place only those who truly understand me may enter." Her voice was soft, almost reverent, but there was a hint of sadness in her tone. Jake looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "What do I have to do to enter?" he asked, his voice steady. Aurelia didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at the door, lost in thought. After a long pause, she spoke again. "This door is not opened by force or intelligence," she said, her eyes meeting his. "It is opened by understanding. By seeing me, not as a princess, but as a person. If you truly wish to know me, you must show that you understand the weight of my crown, the responsibility that comes with it." Jake felt a twinge of realization. This was no simple task. Aurelia wasn't asking him to fight or to solve a puzzle. She was asking him to connect with her, to understand the burden she carried, something no one else had been able to do. He had thought he understood her, but now he realized how much more there was to her than he had first imagined. Without another word, Aurelia stepped forward, her hand hovering over the door's surface. "Tell me, Jake," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what do you think a ruler truly needs? Is it power, control, or is it something else entirely?" Jake thought for a moment. He had faced rulers before, had seen their power and their pride, but he had never truly understood what it meant to hold such power. "I think," he said carefully, "that a ruler needs to be understood, to have someone who sees them as more than just a crown or a title, someone who sees their burdens and still chooses to stand by them." Aurelia's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, Jake saw something in her he hadn't seen before, a vulnerability, a depth that was usually hidden beneath layers of icy detachment. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "You're closer than you think," she murmured. The door in front of them rumbled to life, slowly opening as if it had been waiting for his words. A soft light poured from the cracks, illuminating the room beyond, and Jake stepped forward, ready for whatever lay behind it. As the massive stone door creaked open, Jake stepped into the room, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. The light from the door illuminated a vast chamber, filled with artifacts and relics, but the atmosphere was heavy with something more, something ancient and powerful. The walls were lined with towering statues, each one depicting a regal figure from the past, their eyes seemingly watching Jake as he moved deeper into the room. It was as if the history of Aurelia's people was pressing in on him from every side. At the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood a pedestal with an ancient scroll resting upon it. The scroll was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, glowing faintly with an ethereal light, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change before his eyes. Aurelia, standing beside him, spoke in a quiet voice. "This is the heart of my kingdom," she said, her gaze fixed on the scroll. "This is where the true test lies." Her words were laced with an emotion that Jake couldn't quite place, something between sorrow and determination. "If you wish to prove yourself worthy, you must understand what this means." She paused for a moment before continuing. "The scroll holds the history of my people, their victories and their failures. It is the key to understanding what it truly means to rule, to carry the weight of my title." Jake glanced at her, sensing that there was something more to this than just a test. "And what does it mean to you?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. Aurelia's eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "It means everything," she whispered, "but it also means nothing. The people see me as a symbol, a figurehead. They don't understand the burden of the crown, the sacrifices that come with it. They want power, they want control, but they don't see the human beneath it all." Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had seen it before. The weight of responsibility, the loneliness that came with being in a position of power. But Aurelia's words struck him differently. She wasn't just a ruler. She was someone who had been shaped by that power, someone who had been forced to choose between herself and her people. "Is that why you rejected everyone?" he asked, his voice low. "Because no one saw you." Aurelia's gaze softened, and for the first time, Jake saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I didn't reject them because I didn't want them. I rejected them because they didn't understand what I needed," she explained. "They wanted to possess me, to control me, but they didn't see the person behind the title. They didn't see the woman who needed someone who would stand beside her, not behind her." Jake took a step closer, his voice gentle. "And what do you need, Aurelia?" For a moment, Aurelia was silent, her eyes locked onto the glowing scroll. Then she looked at Jake, her expression softening. "I need someone who understands that I am not just a princess," she said quietly. "I need someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I represent." The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of her words settled between them. Jake realized that this was no longer just a challenge. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the heart of a woman who had hidden herself away for so long. And as the light from the scroll bathed them both, Jake knew that he was beginning to understand her in a way no one ever had before. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken as Jake stood next to Princess Aurelia, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the space between them. The glowing scroll on the pedestal continued to pulse with an ethereal light, but Jake's attention was solely on Aurelia. She had opened up in a way that made him see her not as the untouchable princess everyone else revered, but as a woman burdened by expectations, isolation, and the crushing responsibility of her title. For the first time since he had met her, Jake felt a deep sense of empathy for her. It was clear that her rejection of suitors wasn't born of pride, but out of the fear that no one could see beyond her crown. Aurelia's gaze flickered to the scroll, then back to Jake, as if measuring his reaction. She seemed to expect something, perhaps a judgment, perhaps a final test. But Jake wasn't sure what she wanted from him anymore. He wasn't here to impress her or win her favor. He was here to understand her, to be the one who saw her for who she truly was. "What happens now?" Jake asked, his voice soft but steady. The room, so still and silent, seemed to wait for her response. Aurelia took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "Now," she began, her voice quieter than before, "you must decide what kind of person you are. This is not about me anymore. It's about you." She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "I've shown you the weight of the crown. I've shown you the burden I carry. But the real test lies in whether or not you will choose to stand beside me, knowing everything that comes with it." Jake's heart beat a little faster as the gravity of her words settled in. He had thought the challenges he faced in the galaxy, diplomatic missions, military strategy, and political maneuvering, were the hardest things he would ever face. But this was something different. This was not about tactics or skills. This was about making a choice that could change everything. The idea of standing beside someone like Aurelia, of being part of her world, felt like a monumental decision. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the responsibility it implied, but in that moment, something in him shifted. The connection he felt with her had deepened, and he realized he couldn't walk away now. "I'm not afraid of your burden," Jake said quietly, his words firm but sincere. "I'm not afraid of standing beside you, Aurelia. If anything, I'm more willing to do so now than I've ever been." Aurelia's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such a straightforward answer. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, A small, genuine smile appeared on her lips, a smile that was more of a relief than anything else. "You truly are different," she whispered. Jake returned her smile, the tension between them easing just a little. But even though the moment felt significant, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Whatever path lay ahead, it would require both of them to make choices, hard choices that would define not just their futures, but the future of her kingdom as well. And as the room seemed to fill with an unexpected warmth, Jake knew he was ready to face whatever came next, as long as it was with Aurelia by his side. The silence in the chamber was thick, the weight of Aurelia's unspoken thoughts pressing heavily on the air between her and Jake. As the last of her walls began to crumble, she found herself unsure of what to say, how to react. For so long, she had closed herself off, hiding behind the coldness of her royal duty and the towering walls of her isolation. She had pushed away suitors, allies, and even her own people, all in an effort to protect herself from the very vulnerability that Jake had just unlocked. But here, in this quiet moment, she realized that maybe she didn't need to be so guarded anymore. Jake's words, simple and sincere, had struck a chord deep within her. He hadn't asked to be her savior or her hero. He had only asked to be allowed to see her as she truly was. And somehow, that had meant more than any grand gesture or offer of power. It had meant that, for the first time, someone saw her as more than just a princess. They saw her as a person. Aurelia inhaled deeply, her heart pounding in her chest. "I spent so long convincing myself that I could do this alone," she murmured, her voice low, vulnerable in a way Jake hadn't heard before. "That no one could truly understand the weight I carry. But you're right. I've been pushing everyone away, even when I didn't want to." She paused, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "But now, you're here, and I don't know how to handle that." Jake stepped closer, his expression warm, reassuring. "You don't have to handle it alone anymore," he said softly. "You don't have to hide who you are. Not with me. Not anymore." There was no arrogance in his words, no self-importance, only an honesty that reached out and touched something deep inside Aurelia. It was a promise, simple but unbreakable. The room around them seemed to fade into the background as Aurelia allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed in years: hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt a connection, a bond with someone who understood her struggle. It was as if a door she had kept tightly shut for so long had finally creaked open, letting in a ray of light. Aurelia looked at Jake, the vulnerability in her eyes now clear. "I'm not perfect," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've made mistakes, and I'm scared of what it means to let someone in, scared of what it means to trust." Jake nodded, understanding the depth of her fear. "I'm not asking for perfection, Aurelia. I'm not asking for you to be someone you're not. I'm asking for you to let me in, to be with me as you are, flaws and all." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to settle around them, as if the very air in the room was shifting in response to their honesty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the ancient artifacts around them, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, Aurelia took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she placed it gently on his arm. Maybe we can do this together," she whispered, her voice full of tentative hope. Jake's heart raced as he met her gaze, his own emotions rising to the surface. "Together," he agreed softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. In that moment, the future seemed uncertain, but the bond between them was undeniable. They had both found something they hadn't known they were looking for: each other. And with that understanding, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not as separate individuals, but as partners, equal and strong together. As the days passed, Jake and Aurelia found themselves growing closer, their bond becoming more unshakable with each passing moment. It wasn't just a connection born from shared experiences or challenges. It was something deeper, a mutual understanding that had blossomed between them. Aurelia, once the cold and distant princess, had begun to open up, revealing parts of herself she had hidden away for so long. And Jake, with his patient, genuine nature, had become the person she could rely on, the one who saw her as more than just a ruler, but as a person, with hopes, fears, and dreams. They spent long hours together, discussing everything from the intricacies of ruling her kingdom to the simple pleasures of life that Jake had experienced on Earth. Aurelia, who had always been taught to prioritize duty above all else, was learning to embrace the small joys that came with being human: laughter, companionship, and the comfort of knowing someone truly understood her. She had always thought of herself as alone in the world, her royal status isolating her from any true connections. But with Jake, that isolation slowly began to fade. Jake, for his part, was learning more about Aurelia's world than he had ever expected. The complexities of Salvor, the responsibility that came with Aurelia's title, and the constant pressure she faced as a leader, it was all a far cry from the life he had known. But as he spent more time by her side, he saw the woman behind the crown, the person who carried the weight of an entire galaxy on her shoulders. He admired her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering dedication to her people. But more than that, he admired her vulnerability, the way she let him in, despite her fears of being judged or abandoned. He had never met anyone like her, and he knew, deep down, that his place was by her side. One evening, as the two of them stood together on a balcony overlooking the sprawling city below, Aurelia turned to Jake, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I've made my choice," she said, her voice steady. "I no longer want to hide from the truth or from myself. I want to rule, yes, but I also want to live." Jake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're already doing both," he said softly, "and I'll be here every step of the way." Aurelia looked out at the city again, the soft glow of the setting sun casting a golden light over the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be challenges to face and obstacles to overcome. But with Jake by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came her way. Together, they were stronger than they had ever been apart, and as they stood there, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to take the next step. For Aurelia and Jake, the journey was only beginning, but they knew one thing for certain: they would face it together, not as ruler and subject, but as equals, as partners, bound by a trust that would carry them through the trials ahead. The future, uncertain as it was, held endless possibilities, and with each other, they were ready to embrace whatever came next.